Adebayo coming up with this hour. The message tonight from 25 Hospital Trust is to stay at home unless it's absolutely necessary. So to what extent were patients at risk from the cyber attacks that crippled much of the NHS? Also, can Ukraine host its biggest Eurovision night ever without mentioning Crimea? And is that warning from the president that we heard about in the headlines to the man he dismissed as head of the FBI this week, was it a warning or is it a tweet that was a threatening one? We'll get the week's news from West Africa, including the return of Ebola elsewhere on the continent and the biggest diamond ever found. And don't forget, in an hour's time, we'll open up the phone lines for our World Football phone-in. So this morning we're talking football in Europe and South America. And no doubt we'll talk about Chelsea being Premier League champs as well. I did say champs, yes. NHS services across England have been hit by a large-scale cyber attack which has locked staff out of computers and closed some A&E departments. The so-called ransomware attack appears to have targeted NHS IT systems simultaneously with a pop-up message demanding cash in return for access to computers. The cyber attack also struck other organisations around the world with reports of infections in 99 countries, including the United States, China, Russia, Spain, Italy and Taiwan. Bill Buchanan is a professor in the School of Computing at Edinburgh Napier University. He currently leads their Centre for Distributed Computing Networks and Security and the Cyber Academy. He began by telling me about what a ransomware attack is.
Ransomware attack is where a piece of malware resides on a computer and then generates a new encryption key. It then goes through some files, images, documents, source code, and then encrypts them. It sends that encryption key back to a command and control server, and then the user, if they want to get their files decrypted, they need to contact the command and control server, pay a ransom, and then that will release the encryption key back to them and they'll be able to release the files.
So malware is malicious software, essentially, and it locks your computer system, essentially.
Some of them in the past have locked your computer, but the bad thing with locking your computer is that you can't really connect to the internet and pay the ransom. So typically they will only encrypt the sensitive files such as your images, your documents, your databases, your spreadsheets, Word documents and so on. And then it will lock those so that you can't get them back, but the computer will keep running. So it keeps away from all the places on the computer that allow the computer to work. There's some ransomware that even have a video connection to a command and control center, so you can actually speak to someone in real time and they will talk you through the decryption process.
How straightforward or not would it be to lock the software? To lock the files on a system as broad and as powerful, I imagine, as the NHS's computer system?
Well, it looks like in this case there needs to be a way in, and one way in is through spear phishing, where users will click on a link, and then if a system is unpatched, then it will drop a malicious piece of software onto a machine. But in this case, it looks like it might be a vulnerability that was identified by Microsoft on the 14th of March. It's what's called an SMB. It's the SMB protocol. It's to do with shares of files across a network. And it was announced on the 14th of March 2017 as a critical vulnerability, which meant that system administrators really needed to patch. And now there's been a race, we call it a weaponization phase, where those with malicious intent will now try to weaponize, because they now have a transport mechanism through this vulnerability, and that then allows them to connect to systems remotely and then install the ransomware.
Because, as you will know, it's not just the NHS in the UK that's been targeted. Some other 75 big corporate institutions in countries around the world have been targeted as well. So it does seem somewhat organised. It's not some schoolboy in a bedroom doing this, is it?
Well, once you weaponize, then the code can distribute and can be copied we have what's called the Tor network, or the dark web, where a lot of cyber criminals exist with services, and there is a lot of sharing of code. So it isn't too difficult. We have a concept of what's called crime as a service now, then that a malicious person can log into a web console on the dark web and then get some sort of support to be able to distribute the malware and collect the finance. The organisation that's organising these things will take a cut, such as 20% of the total income. Typically, they're paid through bitcoins, because bitcoins is a cryptocurrency and cannot be traced in the same way that cash can be. So the days when you would pay Visa, you would pay through Visa and so on, really are gone. It's typically all done through cryptocurrencies.
How much damage do you think this could have caused? Will the NHS have sufficient backup systems?
They must. So large organisations will typically be backing up their critical information, and they will be well informed. So something like the finance industry tends to have 24/7 support for this type of attack, and they're well drilled. Hopefully other organisations such as retail, health, and so on are well drilled in this large-scale attack, because it could have a massive economic effect, but also it could cost lives if it was a major one against our critical infrastructure, such as against the power station, power supply type network, could cause large-scale devastation across lots of industries.
What? It could cause loss of life?
Yeah, so it has been modelled that on a large-scale cyber attack, the tripping of electrical power supplies would devastate the infrastructure, have economic effects. Planes couldn't fly because they rely on air traffic control through their computer systems. Traffic lights in London would fail. You would have gridlock. Healthcare systems would work. The lights would go out. Schools couldn't teach. And the whole transport network would fail. So that's the worst case. It happened last year when a small data centre in Canary Wharf in London had a power failure, and it disrupted internet communications in the north of England and some areas of Scotland. So that was a small outage, and obviously a large outage, a large power failure, could cause devastation to our country.
Given this, then, will the NHS and other institutions now have to review their IT systems? How can they prevent similar attacks? How can they fight back?
The two main things is training of staff. They obviously have a large workforce, and you just need one person to click on a phishing email and put in their credentials, and you lose large-scale data. But along with that, I think in this case, it was really the patching of systems. The NHS should have patched all the critical systems so that they weren't exposed to this vulnerability.
Professor Bill Buchanan there of Edinburgh Napier University. Sean